again, welcome everybody to this webinar. As I said, it is the second one in the series of the 4 webinars. And this second webinar will focus on water quality drivers and pollution sources. And today we have 2 speakers. The first speaker will be Dr. Michelle van Vliet. She is Associate Professor in Utrecht University, and she focuses on water nexus, water quality, scarcity, and pollution drivers. And the second speaker will be me, so myself. And I'm from Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and I focus on multi-pollutant modeling and pollution sources. And Michelle, I give the floor to you. I see your slides, but not in the present. Yes, now it is. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, good to hear. And well, thank you very much, Maryna, for this introduction, and of course also for the invitation also to present here in this webinar. Well, in my talk, I would like to discuss some perspectives in terms of water quality impacts on the water scarcity and also the main drivers of this. Well, the first question is, what is actually water scarcity? Well, in simple terms, this actually refers to an imbalance that exists between the supply versus the demand for clean water resources. Well, in the coming decades, a growing and more prosperous global population is overall expected to strongly increase the demands for clean water. And so this is needed for irrigation of crops, also for power plant cooling, for which, for instance, the water temperature is also important to consider. And next to this, we also need clean water for domestic use and also for manufacturing purposes. But at the same time, climate change will also have important impacts, not only in terms of the availability of our water resources, but also its water quality. Well, and on top of these more gradual developments, also increases in the frequency and the intensity of climate extremes, such as droughts and heat waves, and may further increase this imbalance between the supply versus the demand for clean water resources. Well, previously, we worked on developing a new concept and also indicators to quantify water scarcity by taking into account that different sectors have also different water quality requirements. So when we apply this approach, shown here for the Pearl River as example, we can see that during different parts of the year that the water scarcity levels that include water quality, so shown here by the red dashed line, that these are somewhat higher than water scarcity based on water quantity only, which is shown here in blue. So and that's because during different parts of the year, sector-specific water quality requirements are temporarily not met. Like we see, for instance, that during summer periods, when water temperature are high, that this may result in cooling water constraints, increasing water scarcity for the energy sector. And well, for instance, during other parts of the year, when, for instance, salinity levels are high, that this may also result in constraints for irrigation water use, and also resulting therefore in higher water scarcity levels. Well, this concept has also been used by other research groups. Also an example shown here of work led by Ting Ma, where they use this concept to quantify also the impacts of water pollution on water scarcity in China. Well, recently, we also started to implement this concept also at the global level, and also accounting for impacts of water technologies on water scarcity, so including desalination and treated wastewater reuse, as they are also considered as key options towards water scarcity alleviation. So in terms of implementing this concept, we worked on developing a globally applicable water scarcity framework, which considers water supply versus demand from both a water quantity and a water quality perspective. So in terms of the implementation, we use here global gridded simulations of water availability from different global hydrological models, also to account for impacts of model uncertainties. And we also use from those models simulations of sector water use from the main water use sectors. So focusing on water withdrawal, consumption, and also the return flows from those sectors. And so here we focus mainly on irrigation, domestic use, water for thermoelectric power, and also for manufacturing purposes. So next to that, we also account for water for aquatic ecosystem health, also including environmental flow concept. In terms of the water quality side, we worked on developing a global applicable water quality model that includes a selection of general parameters, but which are relevant for different sectoral use, including water temperature, which is modeled in a process-based way, salinity as indicated by TDS, and also organic pollution by BOD. And next to that, we also used simulations of total nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations, which were simulated by the IMAGE-GNM global nutrient model. So by linking those simulations of water quality also to the sector-specific water quality requirements, and we derived these actually from international guidelines, so from and also legislation for each individual water quality constituent and also for each of the main water use sectors. And next to that, we also considered spatial explicit data of desalination capacity and also treated wastewater reuse. Well, and then by combining all those elements, we actually made new quantifications of water scarcity, accounting for water quantity, water quality, and also the impacts of these water technologies, which are also considered as key options towards water scarcity alleviation. So here are then also the results of the simulated impacts of water quality on water scarcity levels at the global scale. And so this map shows the change in average water scarcity by including water quality. So this is averaged over the period of 2000 to 2010, and including this set of water quality constituents that I also just discussed. So what we overall found was quite a considerable increase in water scarcity levels by including water quality. And so here we found an increase in world population under severe water scarcity, which increased from 30% if we focus on water scarcity from a water quantity perspective only, to 40% if we account for both water quantity and water quality. So what we also found is that water scarcity is in particular driven by both water quantity and quality issues in the water scarcity hotspot regions, such as large parts of Eastern China, also parts of India, but also in other parts of the world. And there we see that, that these excessive water withdrawals from the main water use sectors do not only contribute to water scarcity directly, but also the polluted return flows may also degrade water quality downstream. And that is in particular the case in regions of the world with limited wastewater treatment. So, and that may also result in water quality induced water scarcity in downstream directions of those basins. Well, we also looked a bit in more detail on which, for each main water use sector, what is actually the critical water quality constituent that mainly drives these higher water scarcity levels. So there we found that in terms of energy water use or the energy sector, that water quality seemed to be the most, or that water temperature seemed to be the most critical water quality constituent that contributed to higher water scarcity levels. Then in terms of irrigation water use manufacturing, we see actually that this is in particular salinity. And so we see that in most regions of the world, that salinity mainly contributed to higher water scarcity levels. And then for domestic use and also for ecosystem health, we see that this is actually mainly a combination of actually higher nutrient levels as indicated by higher total nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations combined with high organic pollution as indicated by BOD. Well, actually also important to mention here is that these relations between these water quality constituents and those main water use sectors is actually also two-sided. Like for the energy sector, we see that high water temperatures can mainly constrain cooling water use, increasing energy water scarcity. But at the same time, the energy sector is actually also the most important source of thermal pollution in the world. Well, and also, we also see actually similar kind of two-sided relation when we look at irrigation and also salinity levels. Also here we show that for most regions of the world that salinity seemed to be the most critical water quality constituent, but we also learned that in terms of freshwater salinization, that irrigation is also an important driver for this. So this was also concluded based on some research that was done by Josephine Toorslund, who also works as a postdoc researcher also in my group and is also affiliated to Stockholm University. So she actually studied previously these trends in surface water salinity levels from different monitoring stations in the world across different river basins, focusing on the period of 1980 till 2010. So here you see also this histogram that shows the number of sub-basins for each of those main basins, with the red bar showing basins for which an overall increasing trend in salinity levels was found over that period, and in blue also showing a decreasing trend. But she also looked in more detail on what are the drivers behind those trends in salinization in the world. And what was actually quite interesting result is that she found, and it was actually based on analysis of more than 20, or I think in total 26 different drivers, including hydroclimatic, geographic, but also human drivers, and using random forest techniques, so which is a machine learning approach. But based on that, she actually concluded that that irrigation and also irrigated area in particular seemed to be the most important driver in terms of explaining those increases in salinization in those river basins in the world. And so this also as an example of showing that two-sided relation where irrigation is an important driver towards freshwater salinization, but also as shown in the previous slide, and we also showed that high salinity levels can also constrain irrigation water use, therefore contributing to higher water scarcity for that sector. But we are looking in more detail into those two-sided relations between water quality and those main water use sectors, also based on modeling. And for this, we are actually working on developing a new high-resolution surface water quality model at Utrecht University, which we call DynQual. And in the first implementation of this model, which has been developed by Edward Jones as part of his PhD project, we actually focus on water temperature, salinity, as indicated by TDS, organic pollution, as indicated by BOD, and also fecal coliform. So, and as basis for these water quality model simulations, we use the PCR-GLOB hydrological model, which is also developed at Utrecht University. But also in principle, other global hydrological models could be used as basis for these water quality simulations. So in terms of the approach, so we use the sector return flows in order to calculate the pollutant loadings. So those are calculated for each water quality constituent and considering the main contributing sectors for this. Then we route those pollutant loadings through the stream network, accounting also for decay processes. And then also compute the in-stream concentrations, also accounting for dilution. So this framework has been applied at the global level at 5 arc-minute resolution. So these are grid cells of 10 by 10 kilometer. And in this implementation, we also started to work on simulations at the daily time step. And that is actually also with the aim that we are also interested to explore well, not only the impacts of climate change, but also impacts of climate extremes, such as droughts and heat waves on surface water quality, and also in the next step on water quality induced water scarcity levels. And that's also a focal point for also 2 new projects, which will also run in the coming 5 years. Well, important is also to have also high resolution input data also for the surface water quality modeling. Also as part of PhD work of Edward Jones, he also worked on developing a high resolution wastewater data sets, focusing on wastewater production, collection, treatment, and reuse. And for this, he combined actually data from multiple resources, mainly provided at the country level, and developed a downscaling procedure using also the sectoral uses and return flows to also provide calculations at the 5 arc-minute resolution. And that those calculations have also been validated against more detailed reported data. So, and this data set is also freely available for others who are interested to use with this. So wastewater treatment is important. We see that also when we look at our simulations of surface water quality over the last 40 years that we developed. that wastewater treatment is an important driver also in terms of explaining the trends in water quality. But this will also be the case for the future. So in the next step, also and also as part of work of Edward Jones, we also tested the impacts of achieving SDG 6.3, which actually focus on improving water quality by halving the proportion of untreated wastewater by 2030. And so as basis for this, we used the DynQual surface water quality model and also this high resolution wastewater treatment data set that Edward developed. And based on that, we made expansions in wastewater treatment towards halving this proportion of untreated wastewater, and then simulated the overall impacts on surface water quality for different river basins across the world. So here are also some results that I would like to show. So this is just as example, the BOD concentrations and actually the reductions that are presented here by focusing on this SDG target 6.3. So more dark orange and red shows also stronger reductions actually in BOD concentrations. And so we concluded overall that this SDG target of halving this proportion of untreated wastewater results indeed in improvements overall in surface water quality, also in line with expectations. But we overall found is that in particular in developing regions, that this is actually still insufficient to obtain acceptable quality. Also as defined by, or in terms of obtaining concentrations that are below the threshold values. So and this is also highlighted here for one of those locations here in Indonesia. So here also the simulated BOD concentrations on the historical situation is shown in black. Also in red, it's also shown when we consider no expansion in wastewater treatment. And in green, you also see what would be the impacts if we would consider such an expansion in wastewater treatment towards halving the proportion of untreated wastewater in the world, and also in this region. Well, you see that this indeed results in distinct improvements for water quality, but still quite some exceedance are found during different parts of the year. Well, we also looked in towards achieving SDG 6.4. And so that actually focuses mainly on reducing the number of people in the world that are suffering from severe water scarcity. So here overall desalination and also treated wastewater reuse are considered as key options to alleviate water scarcity and the people affected by this. So therefore in this step, we also used our globally applicable water scarcity framework, accounting for water quantity, water quality, and also those water technologies. And in the next step, we made quantifications of the required expansions in treated wastewater reuse to alleviate water scarcity, in particular for irrigation purposes. As in particular, irrigation is the main sector that uses treated wastewater. In terms of desalination, we also calculated the required expansion desalination capacity of both inland but also seawater in order to alleviate water scarcity for domestic and industrial uses. Well, given the limited time, I will only discuss some of the main results that we obtained, but we overall found that we would consider those expansions in these technologies, that in principle quite strong reductions can be obtained in water scarcity levels and also the people on the severe water scarcity. And so that could be reduced from 40% on the present day situation to 14%. But that would also require a quite strong expansion in both technologies. And that is also shown here. So here with these circular bar plots, we show for the top 30 countries in the world, what are the calculated expansions in terms of treated wastewater reuse, as shown here at the left. So on a global level, we showed actually that a required expansion of more than a factor of 2.5 would be required in order to alleviate water scarcity. And then there is in particular strong potential expansion for the countries in Asia, like China, India, also Indonesia. So in those quite densely populated regions, there is actually still large volumes of wastewater that can potentially be treated and reused for irrigation, which is also by far the dominant water use sector also in those regions. Well, in terms of desalination, Well, we also quantified quite strong increase in the required expansion to alleviate water scarcity. There also we found strong expansions, in particular for countries in Asia. But here we also see, for instance, that in particular for the US, a strong increase in potential expansion was found. And also for some of the countries in Europe, in particular in the Mediterranean region, but also in Eastern Europe. And that is also in order to mainly alleviate water scarcity for domestic and industrial uses. Important to emphasize in presenting these results is that we considered in those calculations only these expansions in technologies from a resource perspective. So depending on the availability of wastewater that could potentially be treated and reused, and the availability of nearby located brackish inland water resources or nearby seawater that could be potentially be used for desalination. So actually the technical, socioeconomic and environmental constraints and side effects of those technologies should actually also be considered. For instance, in terms of the large amount or the large energy demands that are associated with expanding those technologies, but also the large volumes of brine that are produced, which is the hypersaline byproduct in desalination, but also the costs and the lack of financial capacity in different regions of the world to expand also those technologies. So, and well, this is actually also a step that we also still would like to make, and also as part of a new project, which will run in the coming 5 years. So overall, to briefly summarize, so overall quality matters for water scarcity and its drivers. So therefore, we worked on developing new water scarcity indicators and also a globally applicable framework of water scarcity, including water quality impacts and also water technologies. So this was used to identify regional hotspots of water scarcity, so both in terms of water quantity and water quality. Also to identify historical and future trends in water quality and water scarcity, and also their main drivers. Also in terms of relevant drivers, we also considered expansions in water technologies to improve water quality in line with SDG 6.3, and also to alleviate water scarcity in line with SDG 6.4. And for this, we also concluded that expanding desalination and treated wastewater reuse that can strongly reduce water scarcity, especially in hotspot regions such as Eastern China and also in India, where we overall see that water scarcity is driven by both water quantity and water quality issues. But important also to mention is that the side effects of those of expanding these technologies, such as the brine, the high energy demands and costs, should also be considered. So this is actually my last slide, also showing an overview of the references to the papers, for which I also highlight some results here in this presentation. So with this, I would like to thank you very much for listening, and I would be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, Michelle, for a very nice overview on the water scarcity and drivers. Are there any questions? You can use the chat and you can raise your hand also. And we can take a few questions for the clarification. And after my talk, there will be more time also to ask questions. So let me check the chat. If there are any questions. I do not see. People need to think a bit, perhaps.
That's also fine. And they can also contact me later if they may have a question. So my email address is also included here. So
yes,
it's also fine.
Yes, and we will have time also for the questions after my talk. So thank you once more, Michelle. Perhaps you can unshare your screen and I can share my screen. I am the second speaker of today. And I need to share my screen. Michelle, perhaps can you confirm if you see my screen?
Yes, I see your screen indeed in full presentation mode.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Then I can start. So Michelle talked about water scarcity, and she highlighted how important is water quality. And I will focus on the sources of water pollution, so the sources that make water quality worse. And the title of my talk is Sources of Water Pollution, a Multi-Pollutant Perspective. On the slide, you see the pictures of the three ladies. They also contributed to this presentation. That's Monroe Van, Jijan, and Yanan Lee. And I also would like to remind you that I am a contact person of the water quality sector in the ISIMIP community. So if you have any questions about that, please contact me. Okay, I would like to start my talk with the three messages, and I will be focusing on them during my presentation. And the first one is that there is a need for multi-pollutant approaches, and I will tell you why. Then agriculture and sewage are common sources of pollutants in water systems, and I will show you examples of that. And at least 50% of the global population today experience multi-pollutant issues. And you remember that Michelle said 40% for water scarcity. And in my calculation, that's 50%, but that's quite considerable. So I will show you examples of that too. So this is a picture showing a lot of green in the water, and that's eutrophication problems, blooms of harmful algae. And this happens when you have a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in water. And they contribute to algae. Algae grow fast and consume oxygen. And then you have this situation. And some algae can be toxic, so you don't want them in water. And then you have eutrophication issues. The other water pollution problem that we are experiencing today is the plastic pollution. And you see an example on the picture. So a lot of plastic bags in water, and they can contribute microplastics also in water. Then all kinds of chemical pollution types that you can think of, and they can come from sewage systems, from pipes, and bacterial pollution, so microorganisms that can contribute to diarrhea, pathogens. So these pictures, just a few examples illustrating that our water systems today have multiple pollutants. So we do experience multi-pollutant issues today. That's why there is a need for multi-pollutant approaches in order to account for multiple impacts of different pollutants, their diverse interactions, biogeochemical interactions, but also interactions in the pollution control. Also, we need multi-pollutant approaches to understand the common sources of pollutants in water. And if we know these three aspects, if we better understand them, then we can explore effective solutions and avoid different pollutants in water systems in the future. So on this cartoon, I show you a summarized picture of the common sources of water pollution. So you see the river, that's blue, and then the land and climate is there, livestock production, crop production, cities, population growth, nature is there, and they discharge different pollutants to the water system. For instance, livestock is the source of pathogens, but also nutrients in water. Crop production can contribute chemicals, for instance, pesticides, but also antibiotics. And plastics, when you use plastics to cover land, so the plastic mulching. The cities, the sewage systems in the cities, they can discharge quite a lot of pollutants to the water system. So agriculture and sewage systems are common sources of water pollution. And this is, of course, the simplified picture, and you can think of other pollution sources, such as industries, for instance. So we try to understand the common sources of pollutants for more than 10,000 rivers in the world. And I'm showing you the map, and the lines on the maps illustrate the subbasins and the rivers that drain into the coastal areas. So we cover the world and more than 10,000 rivers in the world. And we develop the Maryna models to analyze the sources of pollutants. And the Maryna models, it stands for a model to assess river inputs of pollutants to sea. So M-A-R-I-N-A. So the model quantifies the flows of multiple pollutants from the land to the river systems and to the sea. So that's the cartoon that you see on the slide. The model integrates different processes, the retentions and losses of pollutants in the soil and in the river system. It considers the food, water, climate interaction, so the climate is there. Animal crop interaction, it is a special explicit model because it is applied to more than 10,000 rivers in the world, and it is applied for the past, present, and future to better understand the trend. We are developing the website to describe and to also show the Maryna model and the applications of the model. And this website is currently under development. It will be launched very soon. And this is a print screen how it will look like. So very soon you can read more about the Maryna models that have applications to nutrients, plastics, antibiotics, and multiple pollutants. We do validate and evaluate our models, and for that we apply so-called building trust approach. And this is a circle that I'm showing you on the slide. It has 6 options. And option 1 is model validation. That's a classical option that many water quality modelers apply. That's when you take model values and compare with observations, with the reality. Then option 2 is to compare nutrient trends with empirical studies. You look into the past, for instance, and you compare with observed trends in the past. Then the sensitivity analysis, so we test how sensitive our model outputs are to changes in uncertain parameters. Option 4 is to compare inputs with other independent data sets. Then 5 is to use the expert knowledge. This is a large-scale model, so it is difficult and challenging to validate and find observations for all kinds of pollutants. That's why it is important to use more options, and especially the expert knowledge here. And option 6 is to compare model results with other modeling studies. And that's where also the ISIMIP community can play a role, so multi-model comparisons. And if we apply the circle, building a circle trust, then it gives us some indication how we can trust the model results. So I would like to give you 2 examples for the sources of water pollution. One example is on agriculture, so that's crop production and livestock production. And the second example is for the cities and sewage systems. So I start with agriculture. So agriculture is a common source of different pollutants in the river system. And I will give you example for nutrients, pathogens, and antibiotics. And this is the map that shows nitrogen in rivers per sub-basin area, so kilogram of nitrogen per square kilometer of the basin per year. And the background color is from white to dark black, and more dark, more nitrogen in the river. And the pies, they show the share of the sources in nitrogen pollution. So we call it anthropogenic diffuse sources, natural diffuse sources, and point sources. Anthropogenic diffuse are, for instance, the use of chemical fertilizers on the land, and then you have runoff from crop land to the rivers. Point sources are, for instance, sewage systems in cities, and natural diffuse sources are the runoff from natural systems. So if we look at this map, we see on the background a lot of dark black is in China, India, Indonesia, but also in Europe, and also in some parts of America. If we look closer to the sources of nitrogen pollution, then we see that in different parts, different sources contribute. For instance, in China, we see a lot of red, and that's manure discharges to rivers. So manure is not used on the land, but is discharged to rivers untreated. In the middle of Europe and here also in Asia, a lot of yellow colors, and that's the crop production runoff from crop fields. Also in Africa and in some sub-basins of North and South America. And in the Mediterranean region, here we see a lot of red, and those are the cities that are located close to the deltas and where sewage systems contribute a lot of nitrogen. So the worldwide, we see that agriculture is an important source of nitrogen in many rivers worldwide, and sewage systems are important sources, especially in the deltas in urbanized areas. So that was an example about nitrogen. Now I'm showing you another map, inputs of nitrogen, phosphorus, and a pathogen to rivers from livestock production in 2010. So this map combines the pollution levels of these three pollutants, nitrogen, phosphorus, and pathogen. And it shows in a light gray lower inputs of the three pollutants. And then if you go to the darker color, then you have higher inputs of one pollutant or two or three. And if you look at the regions that in Europe and in many sub-basins in India and in general in South Asia, a lot of pollution, so a lot of nitrogen, phosphorus, and pathogen from livestock production compared to the other rivers in the world. So that is about agriculture as a common source of different pollutants. And on this slide, I show you the preliminary results for antibiotics, and in this case for China. So on the pie, you see the share of 5 classes of antibiotics in tetracycline group. That's one of the groups of antibiotics, and there are other classes of antibiotics. I'm not going into details here, just would like to show you that we also calculate the antibiotic excretions, in this case for pig production in China, that you see on the map from low to high. If it is dark red, then you have a lot of tetracycline in pig manure in China, and the units are in kilos per year. And this is the work which is currently under development, and Zhejiang is doing this. Okay, that was one example on the agricultural activities, so crop production and livestock production. Now I move to my second example, which is the cities and the sewage systems from the cities. So sewage systems are the common sources of multiple pollutants in rivers, and I show you two maps, one for nitrogen and one for phosphorus in rivers from sewage systems. And the colors are from light to dark blue. And if it's dark blue, then you have more nutrients in the rivers compared to the other regions. And you see a lot of dark blue in Europe, in Asia. So that is consistent also with the hotspots that I showed you for the agricultural sources. But sewage can contribute more than nutrients. So sewage can also discharge microplastics, triclosan, and cryptosporidium. Microplastics come from, for instance, personal care products, laundry, household dust. Triclosan is an antibacterial agent, so you wash your hands and you use soap, and you can find triclosan there, and then it enters the sewage system. And cryptosporidium is the pathogen that can cause diarrhea. So you see the other three maps, they are similar to the maps of nitrogen and phosphorus, and the same, the color code, so from light to dark blue, and dark blue means that there are more pollution levels compared to the other regions. So, and if we zoom into the hotspots, so there are, and those hotspots of multiple pollutants, they are matching the Europe, South Asia, and in some cases also the American basins. So I am almost in the end of my presentation. I started my presentation with the three messages that we need a multi-pollutant approaches, and I showed you examples why we need that. Agriculture and sewage are common sources of pollutants. I also showed you examples. And at least 50% of the global population live in the sub-basins where a lot of pollution, so multi-pollutant issues today. And then I have one quote, and that's the overall message, that the multi-pollutant perspective really matters for water quality and its pollution sources. And that means that if we want to understand the sources of water pollution today, we have to take a multi-pollutant perspective, and we have to develop multi-pollutant modeling approaches. And only then we will be able to explore effective solutions for clean water in the future.